The string lights swayed over the Doyle backyard, and 300 guests turned toward the cake table right as Eleanor Doyle pulled Colin Ward forward by the elbow. The photographer from the Savannah social pages lifted her camera. Grace felt every eye land on her at once. She turned for an exit that wasn't there, and her hand closed instead around a stranger's forearm, a man crouched by the stage lights with a coil of cable in his other hand. "Act like my fiancé tonight," she said, low enough for only him to hear, her fingers already shaking. Daniel looked up at her, startled, cable still in his grip, and said nothing at all. "Would you have grabbed the nearest stranger, or stood there and let the cameras catch you? Some nights don't give you a better option." 3 hours earlier, Daniel Foss had been the only person at the party not dressed for it. He wore a gray work polo with the event company's logo stitched over the pocket, and he moved along the riverside lawn checking cable runs while caterers set up folding tables behind him. He'd taken the call that morning when the regular technician came down with the flu, and he'd said yes without asking who the client was, because a full night's rate covered 2 weeks of Zoe's after-school program. He called her once, at 6, standing behind a hedge where the noise of the crew wouldn't carry. Zoe answered on the second ring, breathless, already telling him about a board game she was losing to the neighbor's son. "I'll be home before you're asleep," he said. "You always say that, and I'm always right." She laughed and hung up before he could ask about dinner, and he tucked the phone away and went back to the stage rigging, letting the sound of her voice sit with him a while longer than it needed to. The party itself moved around him, like weather he wasn't part of. Waitstaff carried trays of oysters and bourbon. A string quartet tuned in the corner. Eleanor Doyle drifted from cluster to cluster in a champagne-colored dress, introducing her daughter to people who already knew her, angling every conversation toward the same unspoken question. Grace endured it the way she'd learned to endure most things since her father died, a fixed smile, a glass she didn't drink from, one eye on the clock. Her Aunt Carol cornered her near the dessert table and asked, not for the first time, whether there was anyone special these days. Grace said she was too busy running a company to date, which was true, and which had stopped satisfying anyone in her family months ago. Colin found her by the string lights not long after, hands in his pockets, tie a little loose, looking like a man who'd been told where to stand. He was pleasant enough. She'd known him since they were teenagers, their families golfing together every summer, but there was something rehearsed in the way he asked about her flight schedule, her board meetings, whether she still liked sailing. She recognized the shape of it before he finished the second question. Her mother had been busy. "Eleanor's been talking to my folks," Colin admitted, a little sheepish, glancing toward the house. "I didn't push for tonight. I want you to know that." "I believe you," Grace said, and meant it, which somehow made the whole thing worse. Nobody in this was the villain. That didn't make it easier to stand in the middle of. The cake came out at 8, 5 tiers of it, wheeled across the lawn on a cart trimmed in ribbon, and the crowd drew in close the way crowds do for anything with candles. Grace took her place behind it because there was nowhere else to go, and Eleanor took the moment as an opening. "Everyone," Eleanor said, raising her glass, voice carrying easily over the quartet. "Before we sing, I just want to say how happy I am to see my daughter surrounded by people who love her. And Colin, sweetheart, come stand with her a moment." Colin stepped forward, cheeks coloring. The photographer swung her lens around. Someone near the back said, loud enough to travel, "Oh, is this happening?" And a ripple of laughter and applause started before anyone had said a single true thing. Grace felt the ground tilt. Her mother's hand found the small of her back, gentle and immovable, steering her a half-step closer to Colin, and 40 faces waited for her to smile the way she was supposed to. She thought of the headline this would become before morning CEO's engagement. Right here, right now, no correction possible once it printed. She turned her head, looking for anything that wasn't a camera, and found a man in a gray polo crouched at the base of the stage, close enough to reach. She didn't decide to move. Her hand was already around his forearm. "Act like my fiancé tonight," she said again, quieter this time, almost pleading, and stepped half behind him like he was a wall she'd found in a burning room. Daniel straightened slowly, cable still looped over his knuckles, and looked at her, really looked, the way you look at someone who is clearly not performing. Whatever was happening on her face, It wasn't a game. He didn't understand a word of what was going on, but he understood that much, and for 3 or 4 long seconds he simply let her stand there without pulling away. "Play along," she whispered. "Please. Just for a minute." He glanced past her at the wall of faces, at the older woman in champagne silk, still holding her glass aloft, and made a decision he wouldn't be able to fully explain later even to himself. He set the cable down. "Sorry," he said to the crowd, in a voice pitched just loud enough, "didn't mean to keep her waiting." Nothing more than that, no name, no claim, just enough to buy her a few seconds of confusion instead of a headline. The moment cracked open into noise, half the yard laughing, half of it murmuring, Eleanor's raised glass frozen mid-air, Colin stepping back with an expression that read more relief than hurt. Grace exhaled like she'd been underwater. Daniel stood very still beside her, waiting to see what he'd just agreed to. Somewhere behind the stage, Frank Delaney, who ran production for the event company and had been rigging cable with Daniel for the better part of the evening, watched the whole thing over his clipboard and laughed under his breath. He didn't ask questions yet. He had a party to run. Would you have stayed still or pulled away the second the crowd noticed? One choice buys you a minute. The other buys you a headline. The crowd's attention scattered as quickly as it had gathered, string lights and small talk swallowing the moment the way parties do. Grace steered Daniel a few steps toward the shadow of the tent, her hand still loosely on his sleeve, as if letting go too fast would give the whole thing away. "I'm so sorry," she said, once they were out of earshot. "I don't even know your name." "Daniel," he said. "Foss. I do lighting for the event company." "Grace Doyle." She said it like an apology. "This is my party. Was my party. I don't know what that was. Looked like your mother introducing you to somebody." "It was." She rubbed her forehead. "I panicked. I shouldn't have grabbed you. I'll explain to everyone that it was a mistake. You don't have to explain anything to me," he said, and something in the plainness of it made her stop talking. He wasn't waiting for a tip or an apology dressed up as an explanation. He just didn't need one. Frank ambled over a minute later, coiling a spare cable around his forearm, grinning at Daniel like he'd caught him at something. "Well, look at you," Frank said, clapping a hand on Daniel's shoulder, oblivious to Grace standing 3 feet away. "Last I saw you, you were signing off structural drawings for the Harbor Authority, and now you're out here running my lighting board." "Small world, Foss." He said it easy, the way old colleagues rib each other, already turning back toward the stage before he finished the sentence. 10 minutes. We need the follow spot reset." He walked off without waiting for a reply, already shouting instructions to someone by the soundboard. Grace's eyes stayed on Daniel a beat too long. "Structural drawings?" "Long time ago," Daniel said, picking the cable back up like the conversation was over. "Different life." He didn't offer anything past that, and something in his face closed the door on it gently but firmly, the way a person does when a subject costs more than it's worth to open. Grace, still rattled from the last 10 minutes, let it go. It wasn't her business, and she had a mother to face. "Thank you," she said instead, "for not making it worse. Anytime somebody needs a minute," he said, "I've got one to spare." He almost smiled. Then he went back to his cable, and she went back to her party, and neither of them said anything else that night that mattered more than that. Near the gate, an older guest in a seersucker jacket leaned toward his wife and murmured, low enough that only she caught it, "What in the world was that?" "Eleanor is not going to let that lie." His wife just shook her head and reached for another glass of wine, watching Grace's retreating back with the particular interest reserved for things that aren't over yet. By 9 the next morning, Grace's phone had 14 missed calls, all from the same number. She let the 15th ring through while she stood in her kitchen in yesterday's makeup, coffee going cold on the counter. "Who is he?" Eleanor said. No greeting, straight into it. "Grace, who is that man?" "Mom, you've been dating someone and you didn't tell me? For how long? Does your brother know? Does—" "Mom, it's not." Grace pressed 2 fingers to her temple. "It's complicated." "It didn't look complicated. It looked like you grabbed him because you meant it." A pause, softer, almost hopeful. "Honey, I'm not angry. I just want to meet him properly. Bring him to dinner Thursday. Please. I want to do this right. Not like last night." Grace stared at the ceiling for a long moment, weighing every version of the truth and finding none of them she could say out loud without detonating something. "Let me talk to him," she said finally. "I'll call you back." She found Daniel's number through the event company's booking office, feeling faintly ridiculous, dialing a business line to reach a man she'd clutched like a life raft 12 hours earlier. He picked up on the third ring, background noise of a hardware store behind him. "It's Grace Doyle," she said. "From last night." "I remember." A pause, not unfriendly. "Everything okay?" "No, not really," she exhaled. "My mother thinks we're together. Actually together. She wants you at dinner Thursday so she can, in her words, do this right." She winced even saying it. "I know this is insane. I'll pay you for your time, obviously. I don't know how to walk it back without it becoming a bigger story than it already is." There was a long silence on his end, long enough that she thought the call had dropped. "I'm not taking your money," he said finally. "Daniel, I'm asking a lot." "I said I'm not taking your money. Not sharp, just final. But I've got a 9-year-old at home, and if this turns into something people are talking about, I need to know that doesn't land on her. That's the only thing I care about here." "It won't," Grace said too quickly, meaning it more than she'd meant anything in months. "One dinner, my mother backs off, everyone moves on, and this disappears. I promise you that." Another pause, and she heard him exhale, the sound of a man deciding something he wasn't fully sure of. "Thursday," he said. "What time?" Behind him, faint through the phone, a small voice called out, "Daddy, is that the lady from the party?" And Grace felt her stomach drop and lift at the same time, hearing it. "6:30, she said. "And Daniel, thank you." "Don't thank me yet," he said, and hung up before she could ask what he meant by that. Thursday arrived colder than the week had promised, and Daniel stood on the Doyle porch in a collared shirt that still had the fold creases from the store, holding a bottle of wine he'd asked the clerk to pick out for him. Grace opened the door before he could knock a second time. "You didn't have to bring anything," she said. "My mother raised me right. Doesn't matter whose fake dinner it is." That got the first real laugh out of her all week, quick and surprised, gone before either of them could examine it. Eleanor met them in the foyer in a blouse too formal for a Thursday, clearly having decided this was an occasion. She shook Daniel's hand with both of hers, holding on a beat longer than necessary, studying his face like she was looking for her late husband's approval in it. "So this is the mystery man," she said. "Grace has told me absolutely nothing, which tells me everything." "There's not much to tell," Daniel said. "I fix lights for a living. I've got a daughter. That's most of it." "A daughter. How old?" "9. Zoo." "9," Eleanor repeated, delighted, already halfway to a grandmother's math. Grace caught Daniel's eye across the hallway and gave the smallest shake of her head. Don't let her run, but it was already too late to stop the current. Dinner ran 2 hours, longer than Grace had braced for. Daniel kept his answers about work's small and unremarkable event lighting, long hours, nothing anyone would think to follow up on, and turned every question about himself back toward Grace or Eleanor with an ease that surprised her, given how little practice he could possibly have had faking a relationship. Colin's parents were mentioned twice and let go both times, gently, without anyone forcing the subject. Eleanor asked about his late wife only once, carefully, and Daniel answered plainly, an illness, 3 years back. No theatrics, and the table went quiet in the specific way that happens when something true walks into a room built for pretending. Eleanor recovered first, reaching for the wine, steering the table gently toward safer ground. She asked about Zoe instead, what grade she was in, whether she liked to read, whether she took after her father or her mother, and Daniel answered each question with the unguarded warmth of a man who never tired of talking about his daughter, describing the book chart taped to her bedroom wall, the way she narrated her own life out loud like she was hosting it for an audience only she could see. Grace found herself leaning forward without meaning to, more interested in these small, true details than in anything she'd discussed at a boardroom table in months. "She sounds like a joy," Eleanor said. "She's the only thing I got right these last 3 years," Daniel said, simply, and reached again for his water glass, and Grace filed that sentence away somewhere she didn't examine too closely. "I'm sorry," Eleanor said. "Thank you," Daniel said, and reached for his water glass, and Grace watched him steady himself in a way she recognized from her own mirror the year after her father died. Walking him to his truck afterward, the porch light throwing long shadows across the driveway. Neither of them spoke for the length of the walk. He had his hand on the door before she found something to say. "You're good at this," she said. "Scarily good." "I'm not acting mostly," he said. "I just don't say things I don't mean. Makes it easier not to get caught." Was any of tonight true? He considered the question longer than she expected. The part about not saying things I don't mean, that part was true. He opened the door, then paused with one foot already in the truck. "Your mother's not wrong to want this for you, you know. Whatever this is, she's just aiming it at the wrong guy." He drove off before she could decide whether that had been a joke. 2 days later, needing an excuse more than an actual reason, Grace drove to the address on Daniel's invoice, a small shop off a side street with a hand-lettered sign, Foss Lighting and Repair, and a bell over the door that rang thin and tinny when she stepped inside. Zoe came around the counter before Daniel did, quick and unguarded the way only children are, holding up a piece of paper covered in marker. "Are you the lady from the party? Daddy has a picture of you." I drew a picture of you, not a real picture." Grace crouched to look at it properly, a stick figure in a yellow dress, standing beside a shorter one, holding what was unmistakably meant to be birthday candles. "This is me?" "You had the biggest dress there," Zoe said, matter of fact, and Grace laughed with more feeling behind it than the joke deserved. Daniel appeared from the back room wiping his hands on a rag, visibly caught off guard, glancing between his daughter and the woman crouched on his shop floor, like he wasn't sure which conversation he'd walked into. "She talks to everyone like this," he said, half apology, half warning. "Don't read into it." "I'm not reading into anything," Grace said, standing, still holding the drawing like it mattered. "I just came to say thank you, properly, before I let this whole thing end." "It ends whenever you need it to," he said. And something about the way he said it, no edge to it, no bill being handed over, made the sentence land heavier than it should have for two people who barely knew each other's last names 2 weeks ago. Zoe tugged on Grace's sleeve, entirely unbothered by the tension neither adult was naming. "Do you want to see my room? I have a chart where I track how many books I've read." "Zoe," Daniel said gently. "It's fine," Grace said, and meant it more than either of them expected. She didn't stay long. 15 minutes of a chore chart and a stuffed rabbit missing one ear, Daniel leaning in the doorway the whole time, arms crossed, watching his daughter hand a near stranger the contents of her whole small world without hesitation. When Grace finally left, she sat in her car in front of the shop for longer than made sense before starting the engine, trying to name the thing lodged in her chest and coming up only with the word careful, though careful of what, she couldn't have said. Back at Doyle Maritime's downtown office that same week, Paige Wren pulled up the local society page on her second monitor, the way she did every Monday as part of her standing media monitoring duties, and found a blurry photo from the birthday party, circulating with a caption speculating about the CEO's mystery man. Standard procedure required a background check on anyone photographed beside Grace in a public setting, nothing invasive, just enough to flag any reputational risk before a reporter did it first. Paige typed Daniel Foss into the search bar and started scrolling. Would you have looked away from that search bar or kept scrolling? Some jobs don't give you the option to stop halfway. Paige almost closed the tab twice. The first 2 pages were nothing, a business license for a lighting repair shop, an old high school yearbook listing, a 5-star review from a wedding client, thanking him for saving their reception when the soundboard blew a fuse. It was the kind of nothing that made a communications director's job easy. She nearly moved on to the next photo request in her queue. Then, on the 3rd page, an archived article from the Savannah Morning Ledger, dated a little over 3 years back, headline gone slightly yellow in the screen scan. Crane failure at River Street Terminal injures 2. Lead engineer terminated. The photo beneath it, small and grainy, was unmistakably a younger, more tired version of the man in the party photos. She read it twice, then printed it, then sat with it a long moment before walking it down the hall to Grace's office, because this wasn't gossip anymore, it was risk, and risk was exactly what her job existed to flag. Grace read the article standing up, coffee forgotten on her desk. A structural failure at the harbor. 2 contractors hurt, none fatally. An internal review that named Daniel Foss as the engineer of record and closed the case within a month. No follow-up piece, No appeal noted. Nothing after that but silence, and a name that vanished from every subsequent Harbor Authority filing. I don't know if it's relevant, Paige said carefully, but given the visibility, I wanted you to see it before anyone else did. Thank you, Grace said, already reaching for her desk phone. Give me an hour. She used her own authority as CEO to pull the archived incident file from the company's internal records. Doyle Maritime had subcontracted the terminal work that year, which meant the report lived somewhere in their own storage, not just the newspapers. It took her assistant 20 minutes to locate the box in the records annex. It took Grace considerably less than that to find what she was looking for once she had it open on her desk. The final sign-off page, the signature at the bottom authorizing the termination and closing the file without further review. Roger Kessler. Dated a little over 3 years back, when he'd been freshly promoted into operations and by the timestamp had approved the closure less than 6 hours after receiving the draft. Grace sat with that for a long time before she picked up the phone to call Daniel, because some conversations shouldn't happen over a screen, and this was one of them. She drove to the shop after hours, found him alone, closing up, Zoe already picked up by a neighbor for the evening. She didn't ease into it. I know about the crane, she said. I know you were terminated. I know my company subcontracted that job. She set the folder on his workbench. I know who signed off on it in 6 hours without a second look. Daniel went very still, hand resting on a half-disassembled fixture, and for a moment she thought he might ask her to leave. It wasn't my crew's failure, he said finally, voice level in the way of a man who'd rehearsed this speech alone in a truck 100 times and never once gotten to say it to someone who could do anything about it. The maintenance contract was subbed out. I flagged the cableware 2 weeks before it happened. Nobody acted on the flag. And when it went down, somebody needed a name on the closure fast, and mine was the easiest one to put there. He looked at her, tired rather than angry. My wife died 11 days after I got the termination letter. I didn't have the fight left in me to appeal it. I just left, started over, kept my head down. I'm sorry, Grace said, and it cost her something real to say it. Standing in a shop that smelled like solder and cut wire, holding evidence of a wrong her own family's company had let stand for 3 years. You didn't sign it, Daniel said. No, but I run the company that did. That has to count for something, or none of this means anything. He didn't answer right away. Outside, a truck rumbled past on the street, headlights sweeping briefly across the shop windows before it moved on. What do you want to do with that folder? He asked finally. I don't know yet, Grace said, but I'm not putting it back in the box. Roger Kessler heard about the records request the following morning, the way anyone in his position eventually hears about anything, a records clerk mentioning it to another clerk, a name reaching an assistant mentioning it in passing to him, because he'd trained her to report anything touching the harbor terminal file years ago and never told her why. He didn't panic. He'd spent 3 years believing that file was closed for good, and men who believe that tend to have a plan ready in case it isn't. He requested an emergency session of the board 2 days ahead of the annual leadership review already scheduled that month, framing it as a matter of urgent governance concern. When the members filed in, he opened not with the crane, not with his own signature, but with Grace. I've asked for this session, he said, standing at the head of the table before Grace had even taken her seat, because I believe the board deserves transparency about the CEO's personal conduct. Miss Doyle has been photographed repeatedly with an unvetted individual, presenting him publicly as a romantic partner while withholding material information about his background from this board. I question whether someone exercising this kind of judgment should retain unilateral authority over the company's direction. A murmur went around the table. Grace felt the heat rise up her neck, the old instinct to explain, to soften, to apologize her way back into the room's good graces. She didn't reach for it. You're welcome to question my judgment, Roger, she said instead, sitting down slowly, deliberately. I'd suggest we start with yours. She called Daniel that evening, voice steady, but her hands not quite matching it. He's making a move. Tomorrow, full board. He's going to use you to distract from what he did. Then I'll be there, Daniel said without a beat of hesitation. You don't have to. Grace. His voice was quiet, but it stopped her cold. I've spent 3 years letting a lie sit closed because I didn't have the strength to open it. I'm not doing that again. Not with you standing next to me instead of alone. That night, after Zoe was asleep, he sat at the kitchen table with the folder Grace had left him a copy of, and beside it, an old external drive he'd kept in a drawer for 3 years without ever plugging it in again. The drive that held his original field notes on the cableware, time-stamped and dated 2 weeks before the failure, the ones nobody at the time had wanted to see. He hadn't looked at them since the funeral. He looked at them now. Zoe's door creaked open behind him around 10, her small shape in the hallway light. "Are you okay, Daddy?" "I'm okay, baby." He closed the laptop gently. "Just some old work stuff. I'll be back to normal by tomorrow." "Is it about Grace?" He looked at his daughter a long moment, surprised, as he often was, by how much she noticed. "Sort of. Not the part you're thinking of." "Okay." She yawned, already half back toward sleep. "Will you still be here for pancakes?" "Always," he said, and meant it more than he meant most things these days. The board reconvened the next afternoon in the same room where Roger had made his opening move. 12 members seated around the long table, Grace at its head with Paige beside her carrying a folder of her own. Daniel sat in the gallery seats, usually reserved for outside counsel, in a jacket that didn't quite fit but that he'd worn anyway because Grace had asked him to be there, not to perform anything, just to be present for whatever came next. Roger opened again with the same line about personal conduct and unvetted individuals, but this time an older board member, Harlan Reeve, a longtime figure from the shipping side, cut him off before he finished. "Roger, we all read the same social page you did. What we haven't seen is anything relevant to the operations of this company." He turned toward Grace. "Miss Doyle, you called this follow-up session. I assume you have something more useful for us." "I do," Grace said, and nodded to Paige, who distributed copies of the Crane incident file around the table, the newspaper article, the internal report, and the signature page with Roger's name and a timestamp, 6 hours after the draft had landed on his desk. The room went quiet in the particular way. Rooms go quiet when everyone realizes at once they're reading something that will end a career. 3 years ago, Grace said, this company subcontracted maintenance work at the River Street terminal. A crane failed. 2 men were hurt. The engineer of record flagged the maintenance issue 2 weeks in advance, in writing. She nodded toward Daniel, who stood without being asked, and set his original field notes on the table beside the folder, the timestamps clearly visible, matching the drive he'd pulled from a drawer the night before. Those flags were never acted on. When the failure happened, the closure report named him as responsible and closed the file within a month, without appeal, without further review. She looked directly at Roger. "You signed that closure. 6 hours after receiving it. I'd like to know why." Roger's composure held for exactly as long as it took him to realize no one at the table was going to help him hold it. "The maintenance contractor's paperwork was incomplete at the time," he said. "I made a judgment call based on what was in front of me." "You had his written flag in front of you," Grace said, tapping the field notes. "It's dated, it's initialed. It was in the file you closed." Nobody at the table spoke for a long moment. Daniel stood quietly beside the table, not gloating, not triumphant, just present, the way a man stands when he's finally been allowed to say a true thing in a room built to ignore it. A younger board member, new enough to the company to still say what she was thinking, leaned forward. "Mr. Foss, why didn't you appeal the termination at the time? If the flag was documented, you had grounds." "My wife had just died," Daniel said. "No self-pity in it, just fact. I had a 9-year-old who needed me to be a person again, not a man fighting a company with more lawyers than I had years left in me. I made the choice that kept my daughter fed. I'm not going to apologize for that, and I'm not here today asking anyone to feel sorry about it. I'm here because the record was wrong, and it's still sitting in a file cabinet being wrong." The room held that a moment. Even Roger didn't have an answer ready for it. Harlan cleared his throat first. "Roger, I think you'd better explain yourself properly, or step outside while we discuss whether you still belong at this table." The vote didn't happen that day, but everyone in the room understood it was no longer a question of if. Word moved through Doyle Maritime the way it always does, faster through the hallways than through any official channel, And by Friday, the board had convened one final time without needing Roger present to explain anything further. The vote to remove him from his position passed 11-1, the single dissent belonging to a longtime friend of his who admitted afterward it was loyalty rather than disagreement. Roger cleared his office over the weekend, quietly, without statements, and Doyle Maritime issued a 2-line release about a leadership transition that said everything by saying almost nothing. Eleanor called Grace that Sunday evening, her voice different than Grace had heard it in months, no urgency in it, no plans, just tired relief. "I read the coverage," Eleanor said. "About Roger, about the crane, about everything, Grace. The engagement wasn't real, was it? Not from the start." Grace sat down slowly on the edge of her bed. "No, Mom, it wasn't. I panicked at the party and I grabbed a stranger, and it turned into something neither of us knew how to end gracefully." She braced for anger. "It didn't come." "I'm not upset," Eleanor said instead. "I've watched you carry this company like it was a punishment for 18 months. I just wanted you to have something that wasn't a job, a pause, softer. For what it's worth, that man looked at you like it wasn't a job either, before either of you knew what you were doing." Grace didn't have an answer for that, so she didn't try to give one. Monday afternoon, needing to close the loop the only way that felt honest, she drove to the shop one more time. Daniel was locking up when she arrived, Zoe already waiting by the truck with her backpack. "It's over," Grace said, standing a careful distance away. "Roger's gone. My mother knows the truth and isn't angry. There's no more reason to keep pretending anything." "Good," Daniel said, and something in his face didn't match the word at all. They stood there a moment, the kind of silence that used to belong to strangers and now belonged to something neither of them had named. "Thank you," Grace said finally, "for all of it. For that ridiculous night at the party and every version of the truth you didn't owe me since." "You don't have to thank me for standing up in a room and telling the truth," he said. "That one was mine to do regardless." Zoe wandered over, tugging at her father's sleeve. "Are you and Grace still pretending?" Daniel looked at Grace, and for the first time since the party, neither of them reached for an answer that wasn't real. "No, baby," he said slowly. "I don't think we are." Grace didn't say anything to that. She just didn't leave right away either, and neither did he ask her to. 3 weeks passed before she came back to the shop on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. No folder in her hand this time, no reason prepared, no call ahead to warn him she was coming. The bell rang thin over the door the way it always did, and Zoe came around the counter first, exactly as she had the first time, grabbing Grace's hand like it was the most natural thing in the world. "You have to see my new chart," Zoe said. "I finished all 12 books." 12, Grace repeated, letting herself be pulled toward the back room, past Daniel, who stood in the doorway wiping grease from his hands, watching the two of them with an expression he didn't try very hard to hide anymore. "You didn't call first," he said. "I didn't have a reason to give you," Grace said. "I just wanted to come." He set the rag down slowly. "That's a better reason than the last one." Outside, the late afternoon light came through the shop windows at an angle, catching the dust in the air, the way it does in places that have been lived in rather than decorated. And for a moment Grace thought of the ballroom 3 weeks ago, the string lights and the ribbon cake cart, and the 40 faces waiting for her to be someone she wasn't. None of that had felt like anything close to this. A small shop that smelled like solder. A 9-year-old's chart taped crookedly to a wall. A man who'd never once asked her to be anything but honest. Zoe had already disappeared into the back room, chart in hand, calling for Grace to hurry up, and for a moment neither adult moved to follow her. Daniel reached out, and Grace let him take her hand, unhurried, the kind of gesture that doesn't need an audience or a camera or a single word of explanation to mean exactly what it means. "For the record," he said, "nobody's asking you to act like anything tonight." "Good," Grace said. "I'm done acting." They stood there a moment longer in the quiet of the shop, two people who'd started with a lie and ended up somewhere neither of them had planned for and both of them wanted, and then they walked in together to see the chart. Because some things, once they stop being pretend, don't need anything more said about them at all.